All right, good evening, everyone. So I'd like to welcome you to Windows on a Modern World, Leeds in the 1970s. And this is essentially an event to launch an art exhibition that's currently in situ in Leeds City Centre. Series of poster drums about which we'll hear a lot more this evening, documenting aspects of Leeds culture, society, and the urban fabric and architecture in the 1970s. It's co-organised and co-convened, this event, by the Leeds Modernists and the Leeds Civic Trust. And I guess the event is it's been co-curated and co-created by those two organisations. Yeah, I'd just like to, so we've got a panel of three fantastic speakers who are going to be reflecting on, I think, Leeds and Britain more generally in the 70s, society, culture, politics, even the economy through the lens of kind of architecture, buildings and spaces and places. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Clifford Stead, who many of you in Leeds will know well. Lots of affiliations, but he's going to emphasise the fact that Cliff is an artist, a tour guide, trustee of the Leeds Civic Trust, and he also runs the Leeds Owl Trail, among many other things. We've also got John Grindrod, who is a writer on many topics, but in particular culture and architecture in the late 20th century period. He's the author of several works, but in particular Concretopia, which explored kind of origins and experience of brutalism and modernism in Britain in the post-war era, and also Outskirts, which is a really original sort of social and cultural and autobiographical history of the Green Belt. You might remember John's been to Leeds a number of times talking about both of those works. And last but certainly not least, we've also got Elaine Harwood. Elaine is an architectural historian with Historic England, where she's worked since the 1980s. She's also the author of Space, Hope and Brutalism, which came out in 2016, which is a sort of central work on this period. I think it's also worth noting that Elaine's work has been critical to the recognition of modernism as heritage and in preserving aspects of Britain's built 20th century heritage, really central figure in that movement. So yeah, that's, and I guess I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm David Ellis. I work as a transport planner, but today I've got my kind of historian's hat on. It seems like a past life now, but did quite a lot of research and a PhD on sort of the politics of urban change in Leeds in the 1960s and 70s, and also London and also Nottingham, and really looked at how this process of urban change was contested at a local level, looking at planning, architecture, transport. So that's the hat I'm wearing tonight. I've also been kind of involved in the Civic Trust in the past in a number of ways. So going to kick off with, I hope everyone can see, I'm instructed that I'm screen sharing. Got the first image, which is on the theme of leisure. It shows the former International Pool building. The image is actually by Cliff himself. So I think I'm going to start by handing over to Cliff and asking what this image, what memories and thoughts this image triggers for you, Cliff, when you look at it about leisure in Leeds in that period.
Yes, welcome everybody to our event this evening. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I thought we'd kick off with one of the buildings that I regard as a lost icon of its time. It's one of those structures that I wish we still had around today. Very controversial building. To me, it represents where Leeds was going in the 1960s with the motorways, the new age of the Merion Centre, shopping. So for leisure, Leeds's aspiration was to raise the bar above a sort of smoky Victorian city. It wanted to be, as it became the motorway city of the 70s. This particular building, I'm sure many people watching tonight actually swam in there. It wasn't perfect. I always found the water too cold, personally, for me. And of course, it was very controversial. I mean, the architect went to prison. It's got such an interesting story. The pool was, what, an inch too short. They didn't actually take into account the tiles in the measurements when they were doing the length of the pool. And of course, those people that are very good swimmers, me excluded, that swam on their backs would complain that the roof was actually at the wrong angle to the swimming lanes. So they even had to string up tape above the lanes. So these people didn't go into each other's lanes and sort of collide. So it was one of these, what I'd call grand projects, which every city around the world at some stage or other has put something up like this. It was a real statement of its period. As a child growing up in Leeds, we called it the Olympics. We didn't know why we called it the Olympics. It was just, we're all going swimming. We'd all get on a bus and be taken to the Olympics. We didn't realize it was actually a sarcastic joke, that it wasn't the right size. You know, we just thought it was this great, big, exciting building with cold water in it, with a wooden roof that was quite impressive, you know. So again, it's something that I feel should have been saved and converted into something else. So I'm now going to pass over and see what everyone else thinks about this structure.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know we'd move in the order of the introduction. So I guess, John, reflections on this building, and maybe does it any connections to other leisure buildings you might have considered from the era, their kind of importance and legacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I think that strikes you immediately about this building is that sort of sense of excitement and sort of whoosh. You know, it's got a real kind of energy to it. You know, the way that it's angled, the sort of sheer dynamism of it. And as you say, Cliff, you know, that is possibly sometimes slightly at odds with its very sort of practical nature of, you know, people wanting to swim in sort of regulated lanes, and it's slightly almost being so distracting, it's almost impossible to do that. I mean, as a project, it really reminds me not so much maybe of other sort of pools in other sort of towns and cities, but although there was a huge sort of leisure centre building programme going on around Britain in the 60s and 70s, of which, you know, this is a sort of amazing example. But it also really sort of reminds me a lot of the New Town movement, the fact that, you know, health and leisure were sort of very much seen as sort of connected activities, and they're very much sort of pushed by the local development corporations in the new towns, and it sort of almost feels like it comes slightly more from that school than it does from, say, competing with what Manchester was doing or what Sheffield was doing, for example. And there is a lot of that sort of civic competition going on in this period between towns and cities, and you do see that a lot. But in a way, I feel like this is almost aping what was going on in the new town slightly more. I don't know whether Elaine would dispute that or not, but I think that's a sort of quite an interesting thing, that there are loads of different, it's very easy to kind of look at this period and just think there's one current of stuff going on, and there's one sort of, you know, overriding design style, or one sort of overriding political philosophy that is making all these things happen. But actually there are so many different things filtering into this process. Almost the fun of looking at a period like this is pulling apart those strands and kind of thinking, well, actually what you maybe initially think about about this building, you know, the things that we all know about it, you know, John Paulson going to prison, you know, the fact he's not there anymore, and now it's just a surface car park. It's like the most boring, it's gone from being the most exciting thing in Leeds to the most boring in, you know, it's a horrible fate for, you know, a fantastic landmark like that. But then it also kind of represents loads of different things about Leeds and Britain at the time that were all a bit contradictory, you know, a sort of municipal ideals, but also extreme kind of capitalist sort of making money in a hugely corrupt way at the same time. You know, it's got loads of contradictory forces going on.
Elaine, do you want to jump in here?
I have to admit, terrible guilt, and apologise to all of you. David mentioned at the introduction that part of my work for English Heritage, now Historic England, was doing sort of reports and research for getting post-1945 buildings listed. And the university, and it says, I think, a lot for sort of architectural snobbery, but I got the university, which is a much bigger and complicated building, through, but everybody looked at the baths and Paulson and going, oh, look at that detailing. So my Biden mirror, I was trying to find photos of it on the screen, and I think they're all still old slides that I haven't scanned yet. But my memory is orange, you know, so orange, a bit like Cliff's poster, but even more intense orange tiles contrasting with the blue water, because I never got in it to actually swim in. I only saw it as a investigator photographer, if you will. So the idea of all children should be taught to swim goes back to the 1944 Education Act. But it's only around 1960 that the government starts allowing local authorities to raise money or offer them loans in order to build these pools. So like John said, there's a wave of them, excuse the pun, around that time. And they all follow, I think they were kicked off really with the Commonwealth Games, which was held in Cardiff in '58, and they got this international standard pool. And of course then everybody else wanted one, whether old towns, new towns, the lot, with diving boards and junior pools and cafes, but pretty much a sort of standard brief. And I've read that the new towns were in no better position than anybody else because the development corporations couldn't raise the money. It had to come from the local authorities, and by and large the local authorities hated the development authority corporations. They hated having new towns flung on their pristine villages and fields, and so new towns really were playing catch up. And the pioneers were Coventry, where the old baths had been bombed, the northeast, always ahead in sport, Cardiff because it got the '58 Commonwealth Games, and then Edinburgh got the '66 one, so it got a set of baths. And I had this fantastic job for a month running around England looking at swimming baths and trying to talk my way in and making, and appointments and photographing. And you think this was 1994, and you could still take pictures in pools with people swimming. And only the university pools were sort of fussed that I might be invading people's privacy. I know how that changed in 10 years, but it was a fantastic way of looking at sport around the country, because the swimming pools were sort of far ahead structurally of anything else. And then we sort of follow up with the more purpose multi-sports sports centres, where yeah, Harlow was very much in the lead on that because of individuals who were there, and but it proved far harder to list sports buildings than any other building type. You've got the youth lobby, the sports lobby, the international standards. I forget whether it was a centimetre short or not. Standards change every other year. So these buildings are becoming out of date more quickly than almost anything else. And you've got the sort of pressure to do well in sport, encourage people. And in the end, around the country, Coventry and Richmond and one other got listed. The National Recreation Centre at Crystal Palace, and all the others were turned down. So poor old Leeds was one of those. But of course, it's got this extra Paulson side to it, and this amazingly jaunty it's the sort of centre point quality of architecture, isn't it? That in London we associate with Seafoot, and those sort of spiky bits of Niemeyer going on, and that civic style that sort of launched straight out of Brasilia into a cold climate. But it was great. I mean, what I never understood was what else was in that huge building. Yes, there's the great pool hall, but what was all going on in all the gubbins that surrounded it? You know, gubbins doesn't help listing. Was it connected to the proposed pedestrian walkway system in some way, Cliff?
It's certainly, I was just thinking now, when you look at that angle, I mean, the actual corridor around the outside on legs is at the right height, and it's the right style. In fact, it's a posh walkway. It's actually enclosed, because most of the walkways in Leeds, you are at the mercy of the elements, but it's certainly got that logic to it, that it could connect to a citywide walkway system. And the walkway system got quite close. It got to the Bank of England in King Street. So it was sort of working its way across to that building. So I would imagine that logic was to join everything together.
I was going to also ask that this was an era when people were very concerned about leisure. You know, leisure was a problem in this period. What are people going to do with all this new leisure time? They were in this era of abundance that was emerging in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I guess there's the swimming. I think Elaine's comments on the swimming teaching is a really interesting angle. But were there not, Cliff, other leisure activities, uses in this building beyond the pool? Was there a gym or anything that might have been part of that leisure?
I mean, I believe it had a gymnasium in there. It also had 2 swimming pools. It had the main pool, and it also had like a beginner's pool that was quite substantial. It was interesting in that it had a grandstand. So it had a restaurant. I mean, it had this rather wacky restaurant that looked over the inner ring road, which I always thought was quite amusing. So you could take your coffee and you could watch people swimming, and you had almost like a spectator sport almost in the way that it was laid out. You know, it was like an afternoon out. You didn't actually have to go in the water at all. You could just grab a coffee and watch people. I mean, it shows you how the actual culture of society has changed so much.
I think there's also something symbolic about swimming for sort of modernism going right back to the 20s and 30s, that pools and swimming was a really central kind of modernist act almost, in a way that it's maybe not now. I feel like it, particularly around Europe, sort of pools were so central. Anyone wants to comment on that?
I think that's very much outdoor swimming, you know, fun and that sort of Riviera touch that modernism always had, so that you'll see, you know, like the Unité d'Habitation had at least a shallow pool on the roof. And you see modern movement houses with their swimming pools and sunbathing. What a lot of these public pools they have, Stevenage Pool, which is 61, so a little bit earlier, the side was supposed to fold out, unfold, and then so that in summer, so that the indoor pool could be opened fully onto the sunbathing terrace, which faced south towards the park. So that there is that little edge to it, but it's I think it's a little bit more practical than the 30s thing, but certainly they're into you know, improving health and fitness. But you remember you've got the what's it called, the Wolfenden report and of 1960, and there's a second one that year too that were looking at what to do with what teenagers could do. You know, that finding the solution to rising numbers of bored teenagers, you know, who have left school at 15. They've got money to blow. You've had rock and roll, you know, the cinemas are getting trashed, the dance halls are beginning to close, they're moving on to something else. What do? And it's Lady Albemarle, the Albemarle report and the Wolfenden report, and they set up trials, and that's why the Northeast is important, because a lot of the early experiments through the 60s in youth facilities, youth clubs and sports facilities really happen up there.
Before we move on, just to ask John, as a bored teenager in London, did you have a local modernist pool in Croydon, or did you go to Crystal Palace perhaps, to that great centre?
We did. We had a local pool in New Addington, which is the housing estate that I grew up in Croydon, and that literally about 9 months ago was replaced by massive new health centre, a massive new leisure centre. Health centre would be a strange replacement, and that's been a really interesting development, because they've like amalgamated loads of the civic buildings together into this big leisure centre, so that they can basically demolish all the other buildings around it and build housing on them, because it's now a brownfield site. So that was the kind of idea of that. So so actually it's sort of weird really, because that is the community centre, the pool, the library, all of those buildings that were there are all kind of gone or going, or being knocked down. And it's sort of odd really, because suddenly your community sort of loses a lot of its memories, lots of its kind of physical memories of that. Because one of the things obviously about a pool is you have very physical memories of the space. You know, you're like pounding your way through it, and you've got changing rooms and a foot bath thing you go through and all that. You know, you have really like visceral memories of this, especially as a kid. And it's sort of quite, you know, it is quite a sort of physical loss to a place, losing something like this. So I can really understand that, you know, losing this pool for Leeds is, you know, which is a million times more interesting building than the one we had. It's going to be a real loss for the city, because you're going to lose somewhere not only that you know looked impressive and was part of this idealism, but was something that people had very sort of day-to-day physical memories of. So yeah, I think actually a loss of a building like that can really, you know, it sort of, I mean, it has physically created a hole in Leeds. You know, it's not been replaced, you know, on site with anything. But it sort of is then difficult to kind of explain to sort of a following generation who haven't experienced it quite how extraordinary it was, or what it was like, or why it's gone. All of those things sort of feel slightly, it's a bit like Birmingham Central Library, you know, that being demolished. You know, it's quite hard to explain why that's, you know, you have this magnificent modernist building, like one of the best buildings in, you know, in the city, and you knock it down, and then actually it's quite hard like 10 years later to go, oh, that got knocked down because of reasons. you know, no one can really quite put their finger on it in a way. As you say, you know, there's an element of disgust about Paulson and about all that stuff, but there's something more than that. There was some backlash happens, and that backlash recedes and goes away to a large extent, and then nobody really remembers why did we do that?
I think we'll return to that theme in the next slide. I'm gonna move on to our next image of the four, which shows one of the great parabolic arches of Quarry Hill Flats on Eastgate. Though not a 70s building, this shows it in the 70s and its condition in the 70s. I think I'm right in saying, Cliff, yeah, as titled, it's looking from the Eastgate side. So the theme for this one is clearly housing.
Yeah.
This was the decade when Quarry Hill Flats met its end. And I suppose, again, starting in with Cliff, sort of reflections on maybe Quarry Hill Flats in the 70s and its demolition and your memories and thoughts on that.
As a child growing up in Leeds, my grandparents used to live on York Road and I lived in Kirkstall. So when my dad got a car, which is a little blue Vauxhall Viva, and the new Leeds Inner Ring Road opened, it was quite exciting. I think he got a thrill out of whizzing this little blue car through the tunnel and all the lights. So as a kid growing up, you have this very weird juxtaposition between, I lived near Kirkstall Abbey, which was all terraced housing as such. And then, of course, we get this new future on the way to Nan and Grandad's, going up York Road on the Woodpecker flyover. And all I remember is sitting in the back of the car and passing this monolithic grey cliff of concrete on a colossal scale. You know, you'd come out under the Elain, you'd go straight across Regent Street on the flyover, and there'd be this gigantic structure. I never actually went inside it. I think there was a sense with a lot of people, there was almost a kind of intrepidation that it was a bit scary. You know, like we used to shop at Kergate Market, we'd catch a bus. The central bus station had this structure as a backdrop. And so you were always aware of it. You always saw it. It was like this benign presence, gradually deteriorating like an old ship, you know. And it was only when I was about 9 years old, coming back one day in the car, I noticed bits of it were disappearing. And it was like the demolition actually started at the Woodpecker end. And it took about 4 years to tear this thing down. And obviously in the winter months, you became aware that less and less lights were on, to where it got to a stage by about 1976, 77, where we'd pass in the car on a Sunday night and there'd be one light on in the entire structure. And I'd just be out. So I had a little bit of an obsession with this structure, really. More so when it disappeared. I did a lot of research on it. I really enjoyed Peter Mitchell's book, Memento Mori, which got me right back into this building. And again, like the International Pool, I think it shows that Leeds had ambition to do really big, gigantic, world-class things. Okay, they didn't always get it right. The materials might not have been right. But going back to these periods, we did put up buildings that got noticed. That's my sort of thoughts on that.
Thanks, Cliff. So, John, I remember when, well, one of your recent visits to Leeds, you saw this site as is now, and we admired the Kremlin, the DSS building, DWP building as it's now probably known. There's so much you could say about this. I don't know, it's almost hard to think of a primer, but there's something interesting about what became of earlier modernist buildings in the 70s. I guess the 70s was when some of the earliest modernist estates were demolished, and it was city struggling with what to do with the sites. But yeah, what does this trigger in you, seeing these images and yeah,
it's a really interesting image with the boarded up window, and then as you look through another boarded up window through the, you can see it's already going at this point. It's not in its prime. It's something bad is sort of going on in the structure. It's sort of, and one of the things I think that is most fascinating about it is just that it's a building that I think we would all, if you knew nothing about it and you saw pictures of it, you would assume that it was a post-war structure. You would assume that it was built kind of like later than it was, just because of the scale and the fact that sort of other sort of equivalent buildings like Park Hill in Sheffield, for example, were built much later on. And you would think that it was almost part of that wave. And of course it isn't, it's so much earlier. And it actually, the incredible kind of the drive and ambition of creating this structure sort of shows you something about Leeds at that moment of an amazing ability to sort of try and problem solve on a huge scale. And that's the site that it was on, enormous site, and actually quite a difficult site, very hilly, not the sort of perfect site to try and build a great big sort of continuous structure on, in a way, because it's actually quite a kind of complex bit of landscape, and so in a way what happens to Quarry Hill feels like, it starts earlier and it ends earlier than the story of so many of its kind of things that you would put it against, really. At the same time, I mean, in the early 70s or in the late 60s, you've got Hunslet Grange flats going up. It's sort of quite interesting that was an attempt to use sort of new technology, sort of prefabricated system, the Yorkshire Development Group, I think it was, to try and create kind of, equivalent sort of sized and ambitious projects, but to try and do it in a much quicker sort of systematic way, and see whether you can then roll that out really quickly all over the place, not just so you get estates built using the same technology in Nottingham, like Balloon Woods in Nottingham, and sort of all sorts of other estates sort of using that technology. So you sort of see, and that doesn't last very long, because it feels like those estates aren't constructed in quite as as well as Quarry Hill. So you have a sort of issue there with the construction of the sort of more prefabricated Yorkshire Development Group ones that happen in the 60s and 70s, which is sort of quite interesting that it was very hard. It was a very hard building to demolish. Quarry Hill, it wasn't a kind of easy come, easy go bit of housing. And the Alison Revette's book, that I think Cliff, you were sort of waving that around earlier, is an amazing record of, she went round and she, interviewed people, and she went in the flats and she explored the place. That's a wonderful, it is a wonderful record of somewhere that has totally disappeared. Oh, look, hello, look, top
Here we are, Exhibit A.
Lovely. You've got one as well. You've got a match.
I can actually match you there, Elaine. I've got a copy. I think we're trending here.
We are.
Alison Revette's book. This belongs to
if I was in my flat in London, I would be waving my copy around as well. So we are the Alison Revette's fan club.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My copy is the reissue, so I'm very jealous of your original. I've got the 2017 reissue. Isn't that as good?
£25. This was serious money.
A worthwhile investment, I think.
Yeah.
It has been.
To pull it, just to come to you, Elaine. Interesting that this was demolished, I imagine, before any post 1918 building was listed. It went down in the late 70s. I don't know whether you have reflections on. I guess the rise of seeing this as wasn't really seen as heritage. I think it's fair to say in the 70s. From at least from what I've read.
Well, I suppose it wasn't. It got in the way of the M1, basically, and they had just spent a lot of money doing it up and solving some of the problems which Alison Rivets goes into detail, and that's what I was trying to remember from the book. It's such a beautiful image. I mean, Park Hill is in Sheffield is called Park Hill because Leeds had Quarry Hill. There's this wonderful quote from David Ellis that says Sheffield had solid Labour majorities for years after year after year since 1919, but Leeds had the Quarry Hill flats. You know, it was, if Cardiff was sort of first in there on big swimming baths, then Leeds was the place where social welfare, decent public housing really started under Jenkinson Housing Committee from 1933, both out at Gipton and then realizing they had to do something for people who didn't want or couldn't afford to commute in, and so they do Quarry Hill. But you know, it's looking at Vienna. It's looking at Red Vienna, it's looking at Central Europe and the big blocks that were going up there. If you know Karl Marxhof in Vienna, and a lot of the other ones have this sort of continuing loop, and you look through. There's the odd one in Bermondsey, it's about the nearest British equivalent. And then to use a French system, steel frame structure with concrete panels. So it's Paris meets Taran of Hull. I mean, the whole thing's completely radical. And I noticed on the chat, which I've not really been focusing on because I was listening to John, but the Garshi system, which Barbican has, you know, the most elite blocks of flats in the whole country. And it was a sort of system by your sink, but was a water driven. So you could put your rubbish down and it would be sluiced down to the bottom and then collected in a great big tank. I mean, the disposable nappy did for it, certainly did for the one at Park Hill, because of course if Quarry Hill had one, Park Hill had to have one. And it's also revolutionary in terms of, you know, laundrette, clubhouse, community groups, centres, all these things that I suppose the war partly put paid to some of that. But it was absolutely in the international vanguard of social housing. And I think there's one reason why there's not more post-war great buildings in Leeds is that unlike other cities, Leeds was getting in there, doing it in the 30s. And this was just incredible. Now, as to listing, David, Nicholas Pevsner said, I'll do you a list of 50 modern movement buildings. And he went this in 1970-71. So the first listings were all those sort of iconic white modern movement buildings like High Point 1, the Boots Factory, Colonel Warden Lucas houses. So really the sort of very small, discreet, but absolutely the pure white modernism, rather than the sort of mix of modernism, social ethos. There's a sort of bit of classical gets into this stuff because that's what Vienna and co were doing. You know, it's a sort of different Central European tradition, and Pevsner was entirely led by Gropius. And that very, very pure sort of modernism, and nothing else would do. And it was, I suppose it shows how southern these things were. It never seemed to register at all on the listing map, the way that then Firestone, demolished in 1980, did, and triggered the whole interest in wider modernism, Art Deco, interwar, to continue the sort of classical continuity, and then from that into post-war, and then brutalism, and then postmodernism.
Was it? Do you think it's significant that it was council housing? Were there any early council housing estates of the post-18 period listed in that early era of listing 20th century buildings? It's interesting to list.
because there wasn't much that was any good being apart from Leeds. You know,
Yeah.
that's really, we had a battle getting the Ossleton estate through in the 90s, which is the London equivalent,
London version.
1927, which again is looking a bit at Vienna, and the architects went to Vienna and looked at that. If I'm thinking, I'm trying to thinking hard. Silver End, you know, that's was listed. So the housing for the Quittle factory workers, which wasn't council, but it was modern and it was philanthropic. Yeah. And philanthropic up in Newcastle, Tyneside, there was housing by Charles Holden that was a private philanthropic block of flats.
Because I know Livette did a sort of almost prototype for Quarry Hill in Manchester, which again was
down and demolished.
I think in the 70s or 80s. Yeah, so that again, yeah.
Lutyens did big philanthropic housing for the Duke of Westminster, because it's Lutyens that was listed, of course.
Livette was, yeah, perhaps too northern for that era.
Known because he came down and lectured to the Architectural Association.
Oh, yeah.
They all came up to see Quarry Hill. He was really a kind of known figure. I mean, he's headhunted especially from Manchester by Jenkins.
Yeah, sure.
So it's amazing story. I'd love to know more about his later work.
Yeah, I think he didn't live much beyond the 50s, I don't think. He did other municipal buildings in Leeds, a fire station, some schools, and worked on other projects. But I should know his dates. But he was involved in what became Saxton Gardens as well, which is sort of slab blocks
working from home has these terrible things. You just want to reach out and look stuff up.
Well, you check his back. We'll shift on. I'm sure there are many people in the chat who are shouting out his dates and saying you're wrong, David. He did this then, and we'll move on to sort of an image of City Square looking at Park Row and showing a Leeds Corporation bus, I think. Cliff, this
yes, it was still corporation run at the time
before the West Yorkshire era. And this image is around
59. Sorry,
59, yeah, I thought that was So only 2 decades after Quarry Hill Flats. So this is an image around transport on public realm. Got guard railing, buses, the bus stop, and what looks like at least a 3-lane road at that stage, but also some commercial development in the background. So, Cliff, over to you again. Talk us through what you think this image symbolises about that era.
Again, going back to my childhood, everything was new, exciting. I mean, I grew up in a building site. You know, we'd go into town on the bus and everything was being demolished. You know, a week would go by and buildings had vanished. There were wrecking balls everywhere. The bus had to negotiate the new inner ring road, which was under construction in the early 70s. So, you know, a bit like what's going on at the moment where you have temporary roadworks. So there was a lot of things for a child growing up in the 70s to take in. I chose this image for the exhibition because to me, it encapsulates Leeds in 1971, and it's going into its motorway city of the 70s phase. But I also like the fact that there's a hint of old Leeds in there. I like the 2 old gentlemen on the bench, just sat there oblivious of as though the road didn't exist. And I like the fact that there's an Edwardian nymph there that was brought back because people complained when they were all moved away in 1961. So they were just sort of plonked in a line behind some motorway railings, and it's like a nod to the past. And in the background, you've got this new era of overhead concrete walkways. A lot of the buildings in City Square were taken down and replaced between sort of 1964 1971, they basically were working their way round, and they all had the overhead walkway system incorporated into them. And so for me, that image of the period is very much, we're going to the future, we're going to a new place where car is king. If you want to get to Bond Street, you'll be on a high, you'll basically be walking on a skyway, which I used to call it the skyway to nowhere, because you'd find these steps and go up onto it and end up somewhere where you really didn't want to be. You know, it sort of defeated, and of course it was done in a very piecemeal way. So when the Bond Street Centre came, it was added in, but none of it made any sense. And so you were usually up there on your own. So for me, that image is like a kind of brave new world that didn't quite come off.
So John, I mean, this is classic Concretopia. This is sort of Leeds as Croydon. Speculative office buildings, skyways, fairly plentiful carriageways for cars. So this should be an easy one for you to respond to, whether it's on the Leeds side or the broader trends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth mentioning about, you know, the trams have sort of gone, you know, since, you know, they sort of disappeared in the sort of mid-50s. Trams is a sort of really good kind of like urban sort of connection, and replaced very much by the urban motorway by the 70s. You know, that is sort of interesting. Leeds is always looking for sort of a new technological solution that is going to sort of solve the city in some sort of big dramatic way, whether it is going to be kind of, you know, bringing in you know, people like Livette who are going to revolutionize housing, or whether it is looking at the kind of, you know, urban motorway and see how that can revolutionize the town, and sort of keep it ahead of the game. You know, there's a lot of effort in Leeds in this period, but also sort of throughout the 20th century, of keeping up and trying to sort of keep one step ahead of the sort of challenges of the day. And I think what happens in places like City Square is it sort of slightly ends up as the victim of that. And one of the things that sort of happens is there's a kind of, there is an effort to kind of connect up the different realms. So the pedestrian realm, suddenly, as you say, sort of, you know, we're encouraged to go, you know, above ground, you know, in the air on these walkways, and that the car is sort of taking up a lot of width in that space, with these huge urban motorways. It's sort of, it is interesting how, you know, you did mention Croydon, you know, in my hometown, sort of built its own kind of urban motorway sort of through the middle of it. And that is the thing now, that you look at Croydon and you kind of think that is the one thing that sort of stops Croydon from sort of quite being connected up in a sort of very human pedestrian way. And and there are places in Leeds, I do think City Square is the sort of main victim, where it does stop that kind of connection. And it's an odd one, really. When I was sort of researching Concretopia, it's sort of interesting how different towns and cities approached these kind of problems. And actually, if you go to Sheffield, it's sort of interesting how the urban motorway there is kind of tucked underneath, or it kind of, you know, it's never quite blocking the way in the way that in Leeds it ends up as this great big kind of, you know, barrier, really, in some of the sort of central areas of Leeds. So yeah, I do sort of, you know, looking at the urban motorway, it does remind me of Croydon in a sort of peculiar way, even though obviously Leeds has got, you know, is on a much bigger scale. You know, it's a
yeah. I mean, it went for if anything, it beat Sheffield on the scale of its ambition to be realising its motorway city goals. Elaine, interesting. I mean, you can respond generally, but I think one particular angle I'd be interested in your views on is sort of the highways infrastructure in this era. Is that viewed as heritage? Are there and should we view it as heritage, or the flyovers, the multi-storey car parks, the sky walks? Because I'd sort of observed that often we focus on building spaces of that era, but often the highways infrastructure is less well loved, arguably. Not completely unloved, but
I mean, it's a real area for people who studied headways, because they're all disappearing so fast. And anybody that's interested in architecture should be really going out to places like Liverpool and Leeds and the City of London and seeing where those lines are, those first floor walkways. I'm sure that level where the walkway was intended to be, where there looks like a sort of wooden hut structure sticking out on the podium. Super picture. Looks about level with the one on the baths, doesn't it? And the escalator talk took me back to the baths as well. I mean, Leeds has this sort of special thing that the M1 goes to central Leeds. It comes out in the middle. You know, if you're not careful, you end up cycling on it by mistake. I once did. I'm quite good at that. I got quite a long way. I got all the way to Dublin Airport up the motorway on a push bike once. But anyway, whereas, you know, Sheffield, the M1 is a good way away. You know, here it's right in town. And actually, I think in many ways, Leeds, so perhaps because it's the topography is a little more gentle than Sheffield. They seem to have solved it rather better. I particularly like around the university, where the red route and the green route and the purple route really do work, and they were supposed to take you from ground level at the top of the slope into your lecture in the lecture building. I think that is just sort of fantastic concept.
It's really survived that, the multi-level architecture in the university. We're a little short on time, so I'm going to shift on to our fourth slide here, just so I've got enough time to cover a very salient topic for this current period, which is retail and shopping in the 70s. Here we see the Headrow and the Schofields department store as was, and near Land's Lane. You could also comment on the traffic and and vehicles here, but I think the intention, Cliff, isn't it, is to use this as a prompt for talking about the retail experience. So yeah, might have to just so we've got a time for questions. Maybe we'll go more briefly on this one, but yeah, go for it on your responses on retail.
I will keep it very short. Living in Kirkstall, we would get the number 50 bus, which is in shot there. You jump off the back, and of course buses stopped at the entrance to the where you wanted to go, and so you would actually pay the conductor to drop me at Lewis's, and that's exactly what the bus did. I mean, you literally jumped off the back. And this was very much a tradition that probably went back to trams on Briggate and all the main streets in Leeds, where the public transport stopped right outside big department stores. So for me, shopping in the 1970s in Leeds was Lewis's, Schofield. Kergate Market was a big draw. We always used to go in there, especially the open set. The bit that was destroyed by a fire was the bit that we actually used to go in the most, which was like a kind of crystal palace at the bottom. Again, aligned with public transport because the bus station was right next door to it. My only other comment on this picture was this photo was taken by David Hick just before the Headrow became buses only. And so that's one of the reasons he took this picture. This was like the before shot of what came later, where all the buses were taken away and they dropped the pot plants in the road, and it became the Hedgerow was the nickname that the Headrow got in literally a month after this picture was taken. So I shall move on now and let John speak.
Yeah, thanks, John. Comments on shopping. We don't really, this is Cliff, is this the 60s rebuild of Schofield here, or is that the original?
It is, ironically. I mean, I think it's one of the buildings of the 60s that should have been kept. It was a perfectly smart, acceptable building, torn down in 1987 and replaced with the Leeds look that we've got today. To me, that was a perfectly good building that we lost at the time. Again, it had that sense of the podium, and you actually walked through like a corridor almost on the pavement, but it had glass display cases with mannequins in advertising expensive clothes. And the other thing is that it had a heated pavement. I'm sure other people will remember this, where it blew hot air on your legs as you were walking down the Headrow. It was very high tech for its time.
Right, so John, any similar luxurious retail experiences you can think?
Well, I mean, one of the things that sort of strikes me is that Leeds is very much kind of, city of the arcades. When you're going through the middle of it, the arcades are incredible and from, lots of different eras. But at this period, the sort of battle between the arcades, the department stores and the shopping centres that are being built is sort of quite an interesting one. And it's sort of almost like a reflection of 20 years later, where there's a battle between the high street, the out of town shopping centre and online. There are, these competing kind of draws. And actually, it's very difficult to try and keep all of them going all at once. I think that's one of the things that you really see in Leeds. And actually, I think what in the end has happened is Leeds has ended up with a kind of a very interesting, uptown and downtown, in a sort of American city model almost. That it's, you've got kind of, some of the sort of the older shopping centres from the sort of 60s, very much kind of catering to people who haven't got the sort of the spending power of the people who are going into the new shopping centres that have been built over the last 15-20 years. It's very interesting seeing that emergence. I think this this era is very much is an earlier battle between when those shopping centres were new and they were a sort of new threat to the old Victorian and Edwardian arcades of Leeds that we now think of as such a kind of emblematic part of Leeds. Also thinking, I think the Merrion Centre, I think you see it being built in Billy Liar in the background. It's sort of quite interesting that you sort of see bits of the kind of the construction of some of this stuff in some of that sort of social realist film making of the period. I think that's sort of quite an interesting sort of aside of just sort of capturing those moments. And I think that one of the lovely things about this sort of street exhibition that's going on is capturing those moments and putting them in place. It makes it really wonderful. If you're in a particular location and you're actually presented with an image from the past like this, you have an immediate connection to it. What a wonderful thing to do.
It really is. Yeah, I think it's really good at showing sort of scenes from everyday life and buildings, places in context, not just the structure or an empty interior. So Elaine, just moving to you. So how has sort of shopping spaces of the 70s fared, or in your work on heritage? How have they been received? And
John reminded me of Jane Jacobs' sort of Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she argues that all cities need some kind of cheap space. And that was provided by the old buildings. And of course now they're, as John was saying, they're provided by the 60s buildings. And you see in their sort of last moments, things like the Portsmouth Tricorn Centre become the sort of market and charity shop land that people actually could respond to. And it's another example like the Baths, as soon as the building's gone, it starts getting mourned. I just think this is the most extraordinary picture, because how often does a sort of snapshot happened to be taken. So thank you for explaining why it was taken. It is sort of sinister, isn't it? The way that the walkway bit or the podium is waiting to leap over and replace the Victorian. You see everywhere where you go around, say Leeds or Liverpool or the city. And my dad had a Vauxhall Viva as well.
Oh wow, they were great
And it
cars.
was that sort of sparkly, there was a special offer on the sort of sparkly blue colour that didn't take off. Shops, yeah. I mean, I put on the chat, Nottingham, it was going shopping meant clothes, and it meant not the chains we have now. It was Chelsea Girl, really. And really sort of small shops, you know, this is pre-Next and Jigsaw and Hobbs and so forth, and even Topshop hadn't really got much going for it back then. So
maybe the end of the era of regionally dominant department stores. So this was Schofields.
no, they were already linking up because John Lewis was buying them up, but they kept the original names. It starts in the 30s, that buying up of regional stuff, so that they could collectively buy in from the manufacturers, particularly internationally. So something like Jessop's in Nottingham was bought up by John Lewis about 1934. It's incredibly early. And then but in the 50s, they're using their own designers, well, usually with YRM, doing new stores, Sheffield, Coles Brothers, Southampton, Tyrrell and Green, but they're still using the old names. And then it's the sort of 80s where you get this sort of branding. It's got to be John Lewis, it's got to be House of Fraser, and the old names go. Perhaps that was a mistake. You know, this kind of corporate regional branding is good. Like our influence.
I think it's fascinating that process of them buying each other up started in the earlier era. I think another interesting observation I have here is that this was the sort of the out of town shopping centres were looming even in this era. They didn't really exist in Britain in the 70s, but they'd started to obviously emerge in America and parts of continental Europe. But Leeds retailers and the city council were very determined to maintain the primacy of the city centre as the retail destination, and so you got more investment in big modern shopping centres and in the pedestrianisation of the centre to kind of retain the importance of the centre. So despite it being a motorway city with very good links for cars, the centre remained the focus, which I think is an interesting, you could call it a contradiction or interesting aspect of the city then, and tended to be the same in most British cities. They were, unlike maybe some other countries or America, there was a real focus on you went to town, to shop. You didn't go to the edge. That came later, obviously in the 90s. I open up. I would also say we've opened up the chat to questions. I'm not seeing that many here.
We've had loads of amazing comments all the way through though. Really good.
Comments.
Really impressive comments, yeah.
Off the top of the screen and you can't scroll back, sadly. So if somebody's got a note of them, it would be lovely to answer any that we haven't picked up.
Yeah, I think there's there's one around I think someone asking around the international pool, if I'm judging by the time, do the panelists think it would have survived had it been listed? Is one question I can see. Maybe to Elaine on that.
I think difficult because of the size, costs, demands, and the changes in swimming regulations. Swimming pools just seem incredibly short-lived, and as I think Cliff and John said, it was a building that could only be a swimming pool. You know, what else could you really have done with it? And I think that was, it's one of those absolutely impossible buildings to conceive a proper function for. Maybe a library or a market or something that needs a big volume, but somebody put up on the chat about high luminous cement, and if it has high luminous cement problems, you are stuffed, because that's basically quick drying cement that hardens, and over time, because it hardens fast, it weakens. It remains active with the air because aluminium oxide oxidizes very quickly, and it caused a massive collapse in a swimming pool in a school down in Camden in the 70s and got banned overnight, but it still sometimes comes up. When it does, there's nothing you can really do.
Someone had also asked a question, I noticed, about maintenance of structures. I think the question was, to what extent did architects of buildings like the International Pool consider maintenance, to paraphrase the question, because I've lost it now in the chat.
That's the trouble, isn't it? I think the trouble is that they try to design out maintenance to make things, thinking that they're built concrete and zinc flashings and stuff like that would be incredibly, really require little or no maintenance, and that just wasn't the case.
That was sort of part of that whole drive to sort of try out new things and try out new technology, you know, is that it is a risk, you know, and actually in some cases that risk pays off, and in some cases it's an absolute disaster, you know. So and actually it, you know, I can't imagine the amount of detective work that has to go into ascertaining what whether you can actually save a building or what actually the building was made of. It's so interesting. One of the things that I found really interesting sort of researching stuff is just that how often there are no records left. The records that you think that would be left that would explain how something was constructed actually mysteriously vanishing in a lot of instances, which mean I imagine that means making any kind of like listing decision almost impossible, or actually very possible, because the decision has to be no.
Do you struggle to find records, Elaine, as well? I even though I researched this period for my PhD, actually finding the records was remarkably harder than I understand it is for earlier periods.
Well, there's more of them to find. I think that's
of course, yeah.
You know, people take it for granted that there's nothing but it's 1600s, but you're expected to find everything for a building of the 1960s, and it varies. The Leeds University Archive is very good. Sheffield University Archive is negligible, for example. If you've got some public records, you've usually got a chance, but actually finding plans and drawings is very hit and miss. Cities better than old rural or urban district council areas, and there is a sort of online list for these things. If it was published in the architectural press, obviously, then you've got some chance of happiness, but it's completely random, and increasingly becomes important if the building was published and the architect's been heard of, then you've got a chance that the civil servants or whatever we're supposed to be might have heard of him or accept that he's important. And that's not necessarily the case, because not all architects sought publicity, and neither did their clients. So private houses particularly hit and miss.
I think, yeah, I'd wrap up fairly soon, but there's been one question about the Yorkshire Post building, which I'll put to Cliff initially. I think the question was along the lines of, could that have survived had it been listed, or do you think it should have been listed, Cliff?
Yeah, well, I actually worked in that building, and so I had a real affection for it. Again, one of the reasons it was one of the 6 drums is that I regarded it as one of the iconic landmark buildings of that era. You know, everybody knew where the Yorkshire Post building was. People didn't necessarily like it to look at, but it had a lot of secret spaces. I mean, for me, myself and Jim Bruttell, who's watching now, managed to get a tour just before it was demolished. We got the keys to the building and went round once everything had been cleared.
And
we got up onto the roof, and it had these incredible skylights that had a kind of Gaudi in concrete sort of feel to them, which the public at street level would never have seen. And so, I mean, we did try at the Civic Trust to get it listed. We went to a lot of trouble. We still have the clock tower on the corner, which was always a bit of an icon for people coming into Leeds, but obviously we'd lost the rest of it. I personally would have liked to have seen it kept, but what it would have been used for, this is the issue with all these buildings, is what would you use a giant newspaper building for now? And it's being inventive in what to do.
A lot of imagination, I suppose.
What you don't want is a developer just kind of moving in and kind of chopping it up into tiny micro flats. You know, that's the worst possible kind of outcome then, because it looks like you've kept an amazing building, but in fact you've done something really awful to it by doing that. So I think, you know, there is, you know, sometimes it could be a really hard decision, I think, as to work out whether, as you say, you know, what can you do with a building like that? It is huge, but, you know, also as a landmark for the city, you know, actually that disappears from your skyline, something that imposing that you see from the motorway as you come in. That is a real, you know, that is a real loss for the city, because then you sort of slightly lose, it's easy to kind of lose your bearings a bit, you know, or think, oh, this is where the city starts, or the centre starts, or this is where I am. And, you know, those things are really important, actually. If you lose those, it's a bit disorientating, you know. You know, it's not as if an equivalent has been found, really.
It's interesting, John, that it was opened by Prince Charles 50 years ago last week.
Well, he does love a bit of modernism.
I know.
I'm just wondering if that's the building that tipped him over.
Yeah, his opinions changed later, I guess. Elaine, do you want to comment on that one?
Oh, I suppose John Maiden just seems to have had such a terrible time with building the same architects as Birmingham Central Library and the Birmingham Post and Mail. And I think because those had been turned down against our advice, nobody was going to attempt the later building in Leeds. It's he's pretty much, I think he's got one little house listed, and that's his lot. So it's almost a forgotten man. I was think he's laying the foundation stone of the British Library in '62. Sorry, 82 that did the Prince Charles and modernism, but I don't know.
That's probably another talk. So we're well over time. We've reached almost 20 past. So I think at this point I'd like to thank our panelists and allow them to leave and have a well-earned meal if they didn't eat before. Really fantastic discussion, great contribution. So yeah, thank you very much to Cliff, John and Elaine. Really good to talk to you all. And thank you to the 111 at our peak participants. I'd also like to issue a shout out. They've been silent throughout because that's the way I arranged this, but to Flo and Kate from the Leeds Modernists. Here they are. And also really big thanks to Flo, Kate and Mel for organising and administering the event. and to the for the setting up the and along with Cliff the actual exhibition, which yeah, obviously not an ideal time for many people to be in the city centre now, but if you can get there and see it, I'd strongly recommend it. It is outdoors, which is obviously a boon in these times. And it is fantastic in showing you, putting you in the place that the image was taken. It's quite unique, really. And yeah, so thanks to our organisers as well. Yeah, so I think we'll say good evening there. There have been calls for part twos.
Oh,
on other aspects of modern design in the 70s in Leeds, and I'm sure we could talk for a long time on those, on housing, health, education, I think was mentioned, and roads themselves. So yeah, thank you everyone. It's hard to kind of end these virtually, isn't it? But see you later. Thanks John, Cliff and Elaine again, and Kate.
goodbye. Thank you everyone for watching.
Bye.
Great to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.